In the fall of 1993, a young 3-year-old Togolese girl named Farida Nabourema had a bright future. She was too young to realize it, but thanks to her industrious, frugal parents, she would have the means to pursue a meaningful education and career. But when Farida's family woke up on the morning of January 12, 1994, everything had changed. Overnight, her parents lost half of their savings, not due to theft, bank robbery, or company bankruptcy, but a currency devaluation imposed by a foreign power more than 4,500 kilometers away. The previous evening, French officials and IMF bureaucrats met in Dakar to discuss the fate of the CFA franc. For years, the currency used by citizens of Togo and other West and Central African nations had been pegged to the French franc at a rate of 1 to 50. But when the late-night meeting concluded, it was 1 to 100. The economic fates of tens of millions of people had been decided by French leaders, with the complicity of pro-French rulers of countries such as Togo and Ivory Coast. This is French monetary colonialism, an exploitative system of monetary control which has outlasted political colonialism and allowed France to retain control over the economies of 15 African countries and subsidize the French way of life. Despite decades of uprisings, the system stands to this day, but is now being challenged by a new form of resistance: open source code. At the height of its imperialism, the French colonial empire stretched over 11.5 million square kilometers. After World War II, the French had fought tooth and nail to keep their colonial possessions, but eventually were forced to give them up. However, the benefits of the resources and labor of French colonies in West and Central Africa were too rich. Paris devised a scheme to have its cake and eat it too, ending political colonialism while orchestrating monetary colonialism. This was the birth of the CFA franc. The French understand that by controlling the colonial franc currency, also known as the CFA franc, it increases its power against its former colonies and allows it to siphon the wealth back to Paris in numerous ways. The CFA franc was originally introduced in 1945. By the 1990s, it had been devalued by 99.5%. The CFA farmers and producers have no recourse. France still manufactures all of the notes and coins used in the CFA regions, charging 45 million euros per year for the service. And if CFA residents want to travel abroad, they're forced to convert their colonial francs to euros, as the CFA currency is worthless outside their countries. France again takes its cut. With the guise of generosity, France grants loans to its CFA nations for infrastructure developments, but the work is contracted to French companies. This is the infamous double loan. The taxpayers of countries like Ivory Coast are on the hook for the entire loan plus interest, while the French get paid back twice. First, in an immediate sense, when the loan is used to pay a French company to complete a project, and then later, when the principal plus interest is paid back on the loan. By denying CFA nations the ability to produce their own manufacturing-based economies, and by steering CFA nations away from consumption agriculture and towards producing inedible exports designed for world markets, they eliminate sovereignty and engineer dependence. Today, the CFA system has been Africanized. Togo's currency now shows local culture and flora and fauna, but these are only superficial changes. The banknotes are still made in Paris. French officials still sit on the boards of 2 of the 3 regional CFA banks, and the wealth generated by the French authorities in the first 7 decades of the CFA system, when Paris got to keep national reserves and dictate monetary policy, has not been returned. The World Bank and IMF work in concert with France to enforce the CFA system, and rarely, if ever, criticize its exploitative nature. The IMF managing director position has often been held by a French official. Recently, Christine Lagarde. Contradicting the values of liberté, égalité, fraternité, French officials have propped up tyrants to enforce the CFA zone for the past 6 decades. Omar Bongo in Gabon, Paul Biya in Cameroon, and Gnassingbé Eyadema in Togo have amassed 120 years in power between them. Those who resisted French rule have paid a heavy price. Togo's first post-colonial leader, Sylvanus Olympio, formally moved to create a central bank of Togo and a Togolese franc. January 13, 1963. Days before he was about to cement this transition, he was shot dead by former Togolese soldiers enrolled in the French colonial army. A few days later, Farida Nabourema's grandfather and his comrades were arrested and tortured by the military for organizing against the puppet government the French had installed. Gnassingbé Eyadema was one of the soldiers who committed the crime. He later seized power and became Togo's dictator with full French support, ruling for more than 5 decades and promoting the CFA franc until his death from 1967 to 2005. His son rules to this day. Olympia's murder was just one of the many ways in which France has punished those who would overthrow its rule. Whether it was France collapsing the Malian economy by rendering the Malian franc inconvertible, or by pouring huge quantities of counterfeited banknotes into the Guinean economy, their retribution is brutal. Learning about the 1994 devaluation of the CFA franc opened Farida's eyes to the ways in which currency is used as a mechanism of control. Farida's father had his bank account restricted because of his pro-democracy activism. Farida, fearing the same retribution, has turned to Bitcoin, which has been a financial lifeline to keep the democracy movement going inside Togo's dictatorship.
When I discovered Bitcoin, I realized it was a cultural, scientific, and most importantly, economic revolution all bundled into one.
People in the West might be skeptical about Bitcoin. If you have Venmo and Cash App, you might not see why it is important. But when you go to Togo, more than 75% of the people have never set foot in a bank.
Today, Africa is made up of 54 countries and an incredible 46 currencies.
Bitcoin gives Africans the ability to unite on one monetary standard, controlled neither by dictators nor by colonial powers. Money and currency are buried beneath the surface in the global human rights movement. They hardly ever come up at human rights conferences and are rarely discussed among activists. Monetary repression continues to be hidden and not spoken of in polite circles. The reality today for the 182 million people living in CFA nations is that while they may be politically independent in name, their economies and money are still under colonial rule. But even monetary independence from France would not guarantee that they will perform well, or that the country's leaders will not abuse the currency. Today, Farida and like-minded activists are spreading the word of Bitcoin.
It is clear that people are in need of a currency that actually breaks the will, one that cannot be manipulated by governments of any kind.
Cameroonian economist Joseph Tchanjang Poemi wrote, Monnaie, servitude et liberté. The thesis, monetary dependence is the foundation of all other forms of dependence. The final words of the book ring especially strong today. Africa's fate will be forged through money, or it won't be forged at all.
We'll see how long it ends up being, but we're going to do a little documentary about this topic.
Hopefully, because it has information that is very hidden, that most of the world population doesn't know exists in today's world. And I believe that when people get to know about it and we are able to shame the French government about continuing such a practice, hopefully we can attain that political and economic freedom one day.
Yeah, and, this topic tends to shock people, tends to make people outraged. Even most people who are French don't really know much about it. It's not taught in schools there. You were saying it's not even taught in schools where you are, right? People don't learn about why they use this currency, where it came from. So, if we can do something and get the thing on Netflix or something, it could be huge. It could be a sensation.
It could be huge, but beyond that, it's validating, because the struggle against the French monetary colonialism started back in the 50s. And thousands of people, activists, leaders were killed in the protests, and a lot of people suffered, but they feel like their voices are never heard. And when they watch a video like this, it makes them feel like finally people are watching and people are tuning into what we are going through. And it validates their struggle, but also give them hope that eventually things are going to change, because now we have reached a stage where people are starting to hear about it and to want to help to change the system.
Yeah, and just at the outset here, thank you to Parker and the Bitcoin Commons and Unchained teams for hosting us and allowing us to have this chat. Really, really grateful. So just a round of applause for them. My name's Alex Gladstein. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation, and this is Farida Nabourema. And when I first met you, I had no idea that you were interested in financial freedom, monetary freedom. We met because you were the organizer, or one of the organizers of something called Foray Must Go. Do you just want to give us a little bit of a TLDR on what that was and what you did in terms of bringing people out into the streets in your country?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. First of all, I want to thank you all for making time to be here today. I really am grateful for that. My voice is shaking a little because after watching, each time I watch the video, it kind of makes me a bit emotional. But yes, as Alex said, we met in the course of my work to fight the dictatorship in my country. My country is ruled by the oldest military regime in Africa. The Nyasimbe family has been in power since 1967. The father ruled for 38 years. He died. His son took over. And my family, starting with my grandfather, has had a history of resisting against the political and colonial system that was in place. Eyadema came to power for only one reason, because he was sent by the French government to assassinate our first president, who was our independence leader, who decided to break my country free from the CFA currency that the French government imposed on all its colonies. So exactly a month after
And I'll just to pause. I thought it was powerful to have JFK next to Olympio, because he was also assassinated for,
Yes.
We'll see. But similar ideas, I think.
Yeah, actually they died. I think they died in the same year. Yeah. But Olympio was a progressist leader. He was one of the most highly educated presidents in Africa at the time, a graduate from the London School of Economics. He understands economics, and he knew that there was no way we could be free by having our currencies, our entire gold reserves in the Bank of France, having the French government print our money and charging us to use it, determining the value of it and depreciating it when they feel like it. So he initiated a bill to create our own national reserve bank. And a month after that, after the bill was passed, he was killed in his house, and the soldiers that killed him eventually took over and have been ruling the country ever since. So from the beginning of my activism, I became an activism when I was 13 years old, after my father was arrested. It wasn't his first time being arrested, but it was the first time that I became aware of it, because I was a bit older. And ever since, I haven't stopped. And in 2017, the movements that I co-created with young people of my generation when I was 20 eventually blew. And we had hundreds of thousands of our people in the street for the first time in our history protesting for change. And we were met with massive repression, a lot of our comrades killed, some were arrested and are still in prison till today. I fled the country and haven't been back since then. And that's how I encountered HRF, that invited me and gave me a platform to speak about Togo and the struggle of resistance in Togo during the Oslo Freedom Forum. But the whole presentation that I did was about the political aspect. We never really dive into the monetary one.
Yeah, it was interesting. I called you up one day and I said, I want to do an update for our supporters about your work because we had been supporting you. You had won a fellowship from us. And I remember we were talking and I was kind of interviewing you and you started to mention the financial stuff and I got really intrigued. And about a year later, I saw this book come out called Africa's Last Colonial Currency. And I just was very intrigued and I just ordered a copy and I read it and it just totally blew my mind. So then I called you and I was like, wow, you should have told me about this. So we decided to collaborate on what would later become like an essay that I wrote and a part of my book. And we're just trying to create content to help people learn about this. Why do you think that I mean, I guess it's evident at this point, but why do you think that monetary freedom is important for political freedom?
Monetary freedom, I think, is even the essence of political freedom, because at the end of the day, we want political freedom so that we can earn a living and live in dignity. But when you are in a country where no matter how hard you work, you can wake up one morning and your entire savings are completely wiped out and depleted, where the government can be held accountable and the embezzles massive of your resources, you cannot live in dignity. And what's the point of having political freedom when you can't even enjoy monetary freedom? But in our case, the situation is even worse than that. There are a few countries in the CFA zone that have I wouldn't call it democratic, but less authoritarian governments than Togo. But the vast majority are ruled by very brutal military regime and that have been there for decades. The one ruling my country has been there for 57 years. The one ruling Gabon has been there for 56 years, Cameroon for 40 years, Chad for 33 years, Congo for 36 years. So you have these tyrants that were put in place just for one purpose, to allow the French government, the French colonial elite, to continue milking our countries. And the system is far more pervasive than just imposing a currency on us. It's also about ensuring that the French government can buy our natural resources for almost nothing. Why? Because when we got our independence, they imposed what they call a colonial pact on our countries, which gives them the first right of refusal to our natural resources and our inputs. As a result, for every natural resources that are exported in our countries, we have to offer it to French companies, and only if they turn it down that we can decide to sell it to Americans or Chinese or Indians or whatever. As a result, all our natural resources are controlled by France. The oil in Congo, the phosphate in Togo, the bauxite in Guinea, and so on and so forth.
The uranium.
Yeah, the uranium in Niger. Actually, France is praised for going nuclear, but 100% of all its uranium is exported from Niger, which actually happens to be the poorest nation on the planet. So they buy it for nothing, and they need a currency to ensure that they can buy a lot of it at a very limited price, and they need governments in place to allow that exploitative system to be there. And the consequence for us as citizens is not just the fact that we don't benefit from our resources, it's the fact that you are terrorized by these regimes. It's full military regime. The president of my country, people talk about North Korea, but Togo was very similar to North Korea. The president of my country for 38 years, he mandated us, the kids, the students, we have to line up every day from his house to the presidency to clap for him when he's going to work and to clap for him when he's going back home. And 4 times a day, because in the French countries, we have the siesta time. So he goes back at 12 for his siesta. And then when he's going back to work at 2 p.m., you have to line up again to clap for him. And every Sunday, we have to do choreographies. On Wednesday afternoons, there's no school in Togo. We go and practice to dance for him on Sunday, wearing party uniforms and with his picture on it, and telling him how lucky and happy we are to have him as our president, the father of the nation, the founder of our everything. So, and in addition to that, you had military patrols. You can't leave your house after 7 p.m. You may end up dead. The military will crush you. At some point, he was organizing elections because he wanted to look cool, but he was the only candidate in the elections, so we could only vote for him or nothing. So we endured massive brutality from this government only to allow them be in place so that the French government can continue milking the resources.
You know, over the decades, Togo was the target of something called structural adjustment, which I've also written about, which is a global phenomenon where the IMF and later the World Bank would lend money to what is the global South now, or the emerging markets. And it's not just that the poor country would have to pay back principal and interest on a pretty high interest rate loan, which plunges them into an impossible amount of debt, which they can never pay back. What also happens is they have to agree to basically maximize profits and reduce expenditures. And what she's talking about was never asked to be trimmed, meaning the military apparatus and the corruption. Those two things were never asked to be trimmed. It was always things like, you know, subsidies for education, healthcare, food, energy. So, you know, the things that we enjoy in the West, or at least in France, Britain, United States, where our governments do subsidies for, and whether we think that's good or bad, I mean, a lot of people here, you know, probably think that's bad, and that's fair. We can talk about that. But it's more about the double standard, where like right now in Britain, there's a price cap on energy. So the government is subsidizing the energy for the people. And, you know, you have then these big, powerful countries going to these little ones and saying, no, you have to get rid of everything. And then, of course, everybody just starves because they go from having a really mediocre state-run medical system, for example, to having none at all, right? And then there's just, you know, medicine gets astronomically expensive. So you go look at the legacy of these structural adjustment programs, and the CIFA system is like the tip of the iceberg. This is all around the whole world. And what you saw is over decades, you saw people having to work 1.5, 2 times as many hours to get the same 1,000 grams of rice or beef or something like that. So basically, this is what we call wage deflation, and something that I've been looking at. I have a new book coming out called Hidden Repression in May, and is inspired quite a bit by our conversations, Farida. And essentially the idea is that, like, since time immemorial, big, powerful countries have, all around the world, not just in the West, but also in the East, et cetera, have kept inflation down at home through wage deflation somewhere else. So basically, like, the way that we have artificially kept our economies like away from having, you know, inflationary spiraling out of control is by inputs of cheap labor and abroad from somewhere else. It's like, again, it's like a subsidy, and that's really what colonialism was about keeping our way of life subsidized and keeping inflation down by exploiting elsewhere. And this is so crazy because it continues today. Right, you know, in the 80s, we have heard of this thing called the Third World Debt Crisis, right? So this is when Volcker raised the interest rates up to close to 20%. All these poor countries owed dollar-denominated debt, and they just got wiped out, and everything got really expensive for them, and people starved, tens of millions of people. So we're seeing that on repeat right now. So now we go from the Fed funds rate of whatever it was, 0.3 to 5, close to 5, and everybody's worried about stuff breaking in the United States right now. And they should be. I mean, you should be worried about the stuff breaking. But guess what? The whole world broke in the last 12 months. Like, almost every developing country has literally broken. And things have gotten so bad that Americans couldn't even imagine for, you know, let's say 50 countries. I mean, you have overthrows, revolutions, starvations, hyperinflations. That's the cost of us protecting our system. So when the Fed raises rates to keep inflation down here, again, it's directly sacrificing other people. And this is what we agree is a bad system. Like this monetary system where there's like some people who have control and others who don't, whether it be the French CIFA system or the dollar system more broadly, I just think it's wildly unjust. And it's not because I'm very pro-American. I just think this is something we need to fix. And then we can become better Americans, I guess is my take on it. But you found Bitcoin, which I think is an interesting story. When did you start using it? Why were you using it? And tell us about why you created the Africa Bitcoin Conference.
Thank you, Alex. Initially, using Bitcoin was completely accidental. It was at a time in our struggle where we were facing government shutting down the bank accounts of the resistance movements, the activists as well, and actually arresting people who were donating money to the movement. If they have any proof of that, they arrest you. We have people in prison today who were arrested just because they paid for the hotel of some protesters, and they've been in prison for the past 5 years, no trial, and they have never been in front of a judge and no lawyer or anything. So it came to a point where to sustain the movement, we needed to find alternative ways to send money in without the government being able to track it. Safer ways. And the Togolese diaspora was the main contributor to our struggle. What we were receiving money from the diaspora abroad, but how do we send it back became a problem. Initially, we'll have people go to the neighboring country, send it there and collect it and go back with the cash, but it also became too risky. And Bitcoin became that alternative. So initially, it wasn't even about understanding the ideology or subscribing to it. It was just about finding a solution in a dire situation, and it worked. But eventually, I started diving more into it when I had some conversations with Alex. And that's opened my eyes that it's more just than a tool. It's a philosophy of liberation, of political freedom and monetary freedom, most importantly. And I realized that for over 50 years, our countries have been fighting to the logic that we initially had was, if we manage to bring down those dictators, we can have democratic governments, and then those democratic governments, we can push them to create our own currencies and they could resist France. But in the past 50 years, many African presidents that tried to withdraw their nation from the CFA currency were either killed or removed by a coup. So it is a topic that politicians, even in the oppositions, don't want to talk about. If you want to stay alive, stay away from France issues. So I realized that we were doing it maybe the wrong way. It could take another 50 years to get rid of them because they are very powerful, and those dictators have all the weapons you can imagine. It could take 100 years, we don't know. But while we are fighting to achieve that political freedom and build those democracies, we can start switching to Bitcoin. We can start educating people about an alternative. And for them, using it could help them resist in a different way. But beyond that, it's not just a sacrificial thing. It's a technology that actually works perfectly for us, because the banking system in our countries was built on a colonial model that is very elitist. As a result, in our countries, more than 70% of our peoples don't have a bank account and will probably never have one. And you have a bank account. For you to have a bank account, the requirements are so numerous. Like, you need to provide an address, and most people don't live in neighborhoods that have addresses. We just live in our communities, and you need a job and a pay stub, and 98% of the population work in the informal sector. Where are they going to get a pay stub from? So the requirements are so elitist that people are excluded from the monetary system. And with Bitcoin, they can be included directly without having to pass through those institutions. So beyond the ideological resistance against the CFA, is also very practical and makes money more inclusive for everyone.
And you went from someone who was using Bitcoin for activism to someone who wanted to create a Bitcoin conference for Africa. First of all, why was it the Africa Bitcoin Conference and not the Africa Crypto Conference? Secondly, what is the plan? You know, how can, like, tell people about what it's like and give us the dates for this year, and how can folks help?
Well, I think the crypto guys are gonna hate me for it, but the whole idea is we have first-hand experience of using a currency that is controlled by individuals and institutions. And how do I tell people to leave that and go and buy a crypto that some cool guy created in their living room? It just doesn't make sense. It can only be a decentralized currency that nobody controls, that they can entrust their money and their future with. The reason why I wanted to hold the Africa Bitcoin Conference, there are a few of them, but the first one was because I noticed that adoption was very high on the continent already. And in 2020, my country, Togo, which is one of the smallest countries on the continent, like very tiny, was in the top 10 nations having the highest adoption in the world. So initially I thought I was one of the few cool people who knew about Bitcoin. Then I realized, like, nope, the Togolese have been into this long ago, and they are driving it. So realizing that we already have a huge amount of people that are adopting Bitcoin, and very fastly, rapidly across the continent, but those people are not talking to each other. And the payment rails that they are using by over 80% are are not even are foreign to the continent and foreign to our realities. Now there are a few developers that are working hard to build solutions to make it more accessible, such as allowing people to buy Bitcoin using USSD and without the internet. We have contextual issue that people cannot fix with their solutions, that as long as they have never lived in our environment. So how do we bring together developers, the Bitcoiners, the activists, so that the activists can run away with the message and deliver it to the people and make them understand it? The developers can find the solutions to solve some of our user cases and situations, and then bring also investors who can support us achieve that. So that's why we ended up calling for the Bitcoin conference in Ghana. We did it in Ghana because I can go back to my country. I live in exile, and Ghana is one of the few countries that still have a semblance of freedom on the continent. And the first edition was very successful, and the next one is happening this year, December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And I hope that some of you will have a chance to join us there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a phenomenal event. I really recommend you consider coming. It's very eye-opening. Wonderful country, great hotel, awesome culture, direct flight from DC. I'll shill it all day long. And we're happy to support it. We gave a grant of $75,000 to you guys. I would consider supporting it however they can, maybe giving fellowships to people so they can fly, students, developers, helping out. But it's an amazing event. Look, I've been to a lot of great Bitcoin events, This was the only one that no one tried to sell me something the whole time. And I was there for like 5 days. And I think that's to your credit, and we love our Bitcoin companies. They're the best. But there's something different about it, a conference being organized by a Bitcoin activist as opposed to a Bitcoin company. It just like kind of colors the whole thing. And again, I want to thank you for being consistent and keeping your sponsors at a very high level, keeping the companies that are helping you do it, these like great Bitcoin, pretty much Bitcoin only companies. It's very easy to fall into the siren call of all these random crypto companies wanting to like glom on, and that just like was not the case there. It was super, the signal was super, super strong. So again, check out it's afrobitcoin.org, right? Yeah. Check that out. Follow Farida on Twitter. What's your handle? It's Farida_N. And join us. We're pushing back globally. But guess what? Everything that you're doing here the cool part about Bitcoin is everything that you're doing here for Bitcoin is helping her. Like you don't necessarily have to go to Africa or even think about Africa or think about Togo. You just need to focus on your community here and building out Bitcoin here, and we're all helping each other. It's what Jeff Booth calls forced cooperation, which I really, really love. Well, thanks again, Farida, for being here today, and looking forward to the rest of today. Thanks, Parker, and everyone else for having us.
Thank you all so much.